Hello everyone, good evening, welcome. It is so nice to have you all here. And I invite you all to please help me welcome Israel's ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer. And as you rise, I'll ask that you please turn off your cell phones as we begin our program.
Thank you, Cantor Berkey. You may be seated. Anshe Emet Synagogue Senior Rabbi Michael Siegel.
Chicago and the Midwest are honored to have Aviv Ezra serving as our Midwest Consul General for the State of Israel. Aviv is clear in his thinking. He is patient in his ability to listen and represents Israel in the finest way each and every day. We are honored that Aviv and his wife Einat and their children come to Anshe Emet actually quite regularly, and that is our honor. And when the Consul General called with the opportunity to hold this evening with Israel's ambassador to the United States, we readily agreed. But on behalf of all of us, I want to thank our Consul General for his efforts and for making this night possible as well. Aviv?
תודה רבה, כבוד הרב. Thank you, Rabbi Siegel. Shalom, everybody. It is such an honor to be here with you in the presence of Ambassador Ron Dermer. We had the opportunity and the honor to have him visit here during my stay here in the last 16 months. This is actually his second visit to the Midwest. And as many of you know, one of my major focuses, obviously, is to brand and to talk about Israel in the Midwest. But the second focus that we have is also brand the Midwest back in Israel and back among friends and decision makers that are crucial to the connectivity between Israel and the Midwest. And Ambassador Dermer is the key champion to the understanding that for us, America does not end just in the coast, but rather in the heartland of America right here. So let's give him an applause. Now, as the first Israeli Consul General to Chicago that has witnessed the Cubs win the World Series, I take some credit for that. But the truth be told is that Ambassador Dermer visited here 2 weeks after I arrived. He came to Chicago, and he had a visit to Wrigley, and he introduced a special, unique pin with the U.S.-Israel flag that has a secret divine intervention capabilities in it. And God behold, a couple of months later, 180 years of a curse with no goats involved, everything evaporated, and we were honored to have this opportunity to come here. Ambassador Dermer, I want to thank you so much for everything that you're doing for enhancing the U.S.-Israel relationship and being a champion in standing on the defense of Israel's rights for self-defense, Israel's rights for coexistence in the Middle East, and from the Middle East to the Midwest, bringing the messages of the State of Israel. Thank you so much, Rabbi Siegel. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you, Aviv. It's so appropriate that we sit in this room tonight, because in this room we see 6 windows that guide us through Jewish history. On the first window on your left, we see Abraham. And Abraham is overlooking the promise that is the land of Israel. But Abraham, at the end of the day, does not know what that will eventually look like. Rabbi Solomon Goldman, Anshe Emet's senior rabbi in the 1930s and 40s, commissioned this window to stand opposite the one that is here on your right, where we see the early Chalutzim, the early pioneers founding the home for the Jewish people in her ancestral land. Anshe Emet has and continues to be a place that prioritizes, celebrates, and fosters a deep connection with the State of Israel. This year alone, we have had the opportunity to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut with hundreds of children, families, adults, complete with camels. We heard from leading rabbis of the Masorti movement speak from this very pulpit. We studied weekly with over 100 members of our community in the Hartman Institute's I Engage program, and the list goes on and on. In that sense, tonight's discussion is a natural outgrowth of our commitment to constantly learning about Israel. We also recognize that the Jewish people are a people that thrives on conversation and debate. The Talmud is replete with questions, answers, followed by only more questions. Tonight will not be a lecture, but rather a conversation, a dialogue between Ambassador Dermer and Rabbi Siegel. We are honored to have received your thoughtful questions as attendees to this event. Anshe Emet is proud to be home to a diverse array of the Jewish community. And we anticipate that this room is full of opinions that conflict directly with one another. We imagine that most people in this room will at some point hear a statement or a view which resonates deeply. And at some point, we'll probably also hear a statement towards which they take great umbrage or minimally have a different perspective. We here do not fear that diversity. We embrace it. Our overarching value is to engage in substantive conversations rather than shying away from hard questions. And so we ask you to join us in that spirit tonight. Let us see tonight as the beginning of a conversation and not the end. Though tonight will not provide an opportunity for each of us to present our own personal views, we do hope that tonight will spark further dialogue between us all in the future. 20 years ago, Moshe Ben Ari, the famous Israeli singer-songwriter, composed the song Salam, peace. The lyrics are simple. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Let's have some peace soon. So as we begin tonight's program, we invite you to sing this song with Cantor Liz Berkey in praying for a day when peace will be upon us all.
Od yavo shalom aleinu, od yavo shalom aleinu, od yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam. Od yavo shalom aleinu, od yavo shalom aleinu, od yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam. Salam aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam, salam, salam aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam, salam. Od yavo shalom aleinu, od yavo shalom aleinu, od yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam.
Thank you, Cantor Berkey. At this time, we invite the Assistant Director of the American Jewish Committee in Chicago and proud member of Anshe Emet, Barbara Cantrow.
Good evening. My name is Barbara Cantrow. I'm proud to be here as Chicago's Interfaith Director and a member of Anshe Emet Synagogue. Well, Anshe Emet Synagogue is my spiritual home. AJC is my Jewish advocacy home. I'm also proud to announce that in a few days, more than 80 Chicago AJC members will be joining more than 2,000 advocates from around the world in Jerusalem for AJC's 2018 Global Forum. Tonight, it's my honor to introduce our speaker, Israel's ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer. Ambassador Dermer was born and raised in Miami Beach, Florida. He earned a degree in finance and management from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania and a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford University. For 3 years, he was a columnist with the Jerusalem Post. In 2004, Ambassador Dermer co-authored with Natan Sharansky the best-selling book, The Case for Democracy, The Power of Freedom to Overcome Tyranny and Terror, which has been translated into 10 languages. From 2005 to 2008, he served as Israel's Minister of Economic Affairs in the United States. From 2009 to 2013, Ambassador Dermer served as Senior Advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ambassador Dermer.
Thank you. You forgot one thing on my resume. I threw out the first pitch at the Cubs game tonight.
Pretty amazing.
That's a pretty big deal. Wrigley Field, pretty big deal.
I would say. The fact that Rabbi Solomon Goldman could envision the state of Israel when he put that window in the 1930s does not indicate that he could have ever envisioned an ambassador from the state of Israel with a Cubs jersey that said Israel on the back. Pretty amazing. It's a great honor to welcome you.
Thank you.
Tonight is the 51st anniversary of the start of the Six-Day War. In 1967, the Jewish community was fearful. The Jewish community was preparing for a mass slaughter. And yet, 6 days later, Israel's reality changed. So let's begin with this question. What are your thoughts on this day?
Well, first of all, thank you for welcoming me into your synagogue and beautiful, really beautiful synagogue and beautiful windows, and I'm sure there's a remarkable story behind each and every one of them. what it means 51 years ago today, as you said, it was a time of great fear in Israel. You know, we live at a time where if you're not over the age of 75 or 80, you do not remember a world without Israel. Those people who are over 80 years old or had a very close relationship, maybe they're a little bit younger, but they had a close relationship with their parents who would talk to them about what the world was like before there was in Israel, they appreciate Israel in a different way. And if you're not over the age of 55 or even 60, you don't remember a vulnerable Israel, because the image that most people have under 50 is a very powerful Israel. And it's true that Israel's a rising power in the world. We just had last year there was a survey that was done, a study of the most powerful countries in the world. And Israel came in 8th. And the survey wasn't done by the local chapter of Hadassah in Nashville. Not that I have anything against Hadassah or Nashville. Lifetime members, mother, grandmother, sister, and daughter, Golda. But it's a remarkable thing to think in 70 years that a country the size of New Jersey, that has a population of fewer than 9 million people, would be considered the 8th most powerful country in the world. There's the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. There's Russia and America and Britain and France and China. Then there's Japan and Germany. The smallest country in that group has about 60 million people in it. And yet Israel is a real powerful country. Of course, it's a country that can go from great strength to great vulnerability like that if we make mistakes. And we have to be concerned not to make mistakes, because we are strong, but we're very small. About 95% of our security problems are because of the physical size of our country. I know that most people think that the biggest problem in the Middle East is that Israel's too big, but 95% of our security challenges is because we're tiny. If we were a country the size of the United States, which is 500 times the size of Israel, security problems that we have, like in Gaza on our border, like missiles, short-range missiles, that would be border issues. This conflict did not begin on June 4th, 1967. A lot of people say, well, just go back to the June 4th, 1967 lines. Well, those were not lines of peace. Those were lines of war. So you have to ask yourself, well, what was that conflict about? Well, it wasn't about all those issues that took place after 1967, the settlements, territorial issues. There was a conflict 50 years before that war in 1967. And you have to remember that on this day, that it's not about a lot of those issues that so many people in the world believe the conflict is about, because we had a conflict for a half century before. And when you keep that in mind, you realize that the conflict, our conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, is the same conflict it's been for an entire century. And it comes down to one central question. It doesn't mean that there are not other issues that could exacerbate it, they could make it more complicated or less complicated, but the main question, it was the question that was placed before the UN in 1947. When that partition resolution came, do you, 2 states for 2 peoples, a Jewish state and an Arab state, do you accept that? No refugees at that time, no settlements issue, none of the other issues. And there's a refusal then and for the last century to recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state in any boundary. That's what the conflict is about. And I hope that the day will come soon when Palestinian leaders will truly say that the Jewish people are in the land of Israel by right and not just by might. And when they say that we have a right, they can say, by the way, they have rights too. They can say, you're here by right and we're here by right. Second they say that, that's a negotiation. They can even say it's 99% ours, it's 1% yours, then you're in a negotiation. But when they say you stole our house and you have no rights in this land and you have no history in this land, then you're not going to be able to achieve peace. And I think today, 51 years later, should remind us of this basic truth, and we should recognize what the core issues is in this conflict and work to enable one day for the crossing of this psychological Rubicon to recognize that the Jewish people are in their historic homeland by right and not just by might.
Since you raised the issue of Palestinians, let me ask you this question then. And I'm going to quote you. When you addressed the Jerusalem Post annual conference in New York this past April, you were very critical of world powers supporting an initiative by France to outline parameters for peace between Israel and the Palestinians as, quote, ignoring the will of the free people who live in the most endangered democracy on earth. These powers, albeit with the best of intentions, will only encourage the Palestinians to continue their 100-year campaign to destroy the one and only Jewish state. Such an effort will not only prevent peace today, you said, but could prevent peace for decades to come and bolster international efforts to delegitimize Israel. Having said that, now 70 years later, what does a peaceful solution between Israelis and Palestinians look like to you? And how do you think we get there?
Well, look, the point that I was making there, I think it was a couple of years ago at the Jerusalem Post conference, is there were all sorts of proposals that were being made by international actors. And I want to remind people that Israel is a democracy. You know, you talk, I heard the rabbi before, an open debate and dialogue and everything else. You guys should come to the Knesset. If you really want to have a good time, if you like open debate, you should come to the Knesset. I remember a few years ago, you probably remember this, President Obama had a State of the Union, and Congressman Wilson from South Carolina yelled out in the middle, "You lie," to the president. And people were just aghast because it's such a violation of the norms and protocol in American politics. Well, the next morning, about 7 a.m., I was in the Prime Minister's office working on a speech with someone for the Prime Minister who was going to give the Knesset later that day, and we turn on the television and we see CNN, and they're still reporting about this unbelievable thing that was just done by Congressman Wilson, and how outrageous it was that they had said about the President of the United States that he was a liar. And I said, wow, if we could get the Prime Minister into and out of the Knesset with only one guy calling him a liar, they would give us the Israel Prize. So look, we're used to big debates, and like I said, it's great that the Jews have the ability to debate here and that we have free country in Israel. And the point that I'm making about people from abroad coming up with all sorts of proposals, in this case it was a French proposal. Look, the people of Israel need to make the decisions when it comes to their security and their lives, because they're the ones that have to defend those lives. They have to live with those decisions. We may make decisions in Israel that you disagree with. You may think it's the wrong decision, and you're welcome to voice your opinion. And I do think that Jews in America have a voice, that they don't have a vote, but they have a voice. And their voice is different than the voice of non-Jews. We deeply appreciate the support of non-Jews, no matter where they are, for Israel. But the relationship between Israel and Jews is fundamentally different. The most important law in Israel is the law of return, which enables Jews anywhere to come tomorrow and become citizens of Israel. So you, whether you like it or not, you are potential citizens of Israel. All of you here. And your children and your grandchildren are potential citizens of Israel. But I think there should be a respect for the sovereign decisions that are made in Israel. We are a free country, and our people go to the polls, and they elect leaders on platforms, and they believe this or that leader, however they vote, has the right platform and the right policies that are going to keep them safe or keep the country prosperous, and social issues and economic issues and foreign policy issues and all that. We decide. Israel is not a thought experiment on a whiteboard. We're a living, breathing people. And a lot of times when I hear people from the outside saying, well, this is what's in the best interests of Israel, well, that's your opinion. But the ones who are going to decide what is in the best interests of Israel, the ones who should decide, are the people of Israel. And that should be respected. You know, occasionally there are days in Israel when people are less than grateful for the leadership of our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Occasionally he's criticized in our press. This may shock you. Thank you. And I usually tell him on those days, you know, what are you complaining about? Look at Moses. You know, he did 10 plagues. He splits the sea. He goes up for 40 days and 40 nights. He's 8 hours late and he gets a golden calf. We're tough people, okay? So, you know, that's fine. I get it. As to your question, getting back to your
question. The Prime
question.
Minister should try being a congregational rabbi for a day. He'll run back to the Knesset, I think.
No, he's only in politics 101. You're much higher. It takes a while. First you go through the Knesset, then you get to be a pulpit rabbi. But as you say, look, what kind of solution would we like to see with, and compromise would we like to see with the Palestinians? Obviously, you want to see a compromise. You want to see Israel's at peace. We waited 3 decades for our first peace agreement until 1977 when Sadat made his historic visit to Jerusalem, and ultimately we were able to make a peace treaty with Egypt, and we had peace with Jordan de facto since 1970, but de jure only in 1994. We waited another 15 years or so after the peace agreement with Egypt to have peace with Jordan, but we were blessed with it. But the first 3 decades of Israel's existence, we didn't have peace with anybody. And what we didn't do is throw up our hands. What we did was strengthen our country and build up our military, our economy, because we understand that a strong Israel is one that our neighbors will make peace with. A weak Israel is not an Israel that they're going to make peace with. And we'd like to see peace expand to every country in the region, including the Palestinians. And I said to you what the core problem that we face with the Palestinians is crossing this Rubicon to enable an acceptance of a Jewish state in any boundary. Now, you can't make peace with yourself. You need a partner on the other side that is willing to cross that Rubicon. And Israel tried to actually do things by itself. We tried a unilateral withdrawal. So in the case of Gaza, which was mentioned, I think, a couple times, in the case of Gaza, and I know sometimes their sense of history goes all the way back to breakfast. In the case of Gaza, Israel left Gaza in 2005, and we did what many people in the international community said Israel should do in order to achieve peace. They say, go back to the 1967 lines, right? Check. Uproot the settlements. Check. We took 10,000 people out of their homes in Gaza. We disinterred people from their graves in Gaza. And we went back to that 67 line, and there was hope at the time by people who supported the disengagement that this would lead to a new hope for peace. And James Wolfensohn was the president of the World Bank at the time, and he went around to actually collect money from prominent people to buy greenhouses in Gaza, to give them to the Palestinians, and help their economy, help them export. So that area, Gaza, could become a Singapore of the Middle East. And unfortunately, what happened is those greenhouses were destroyed. Hamas, a terror organization that is openly committed to Israel's destruction, and those people, I don't know if they realize it, they call for the murder of Jews worldwide. It's a genocidal movement that controls Gaza. And they say it openly. They don't hide it. Just had the other week, the head of Hamas said, we're going to go and rip the hearts out of the Jews. That's not something you yell at a synagogue. That's what the leader of Hamas said in Gaza. And believe me, the people in those communities who are hundreds, 300, 400, 500 yards away, when they hear that, they pray to God that their sons and daughters who serve in that army protecting them will prevent the people who call for that slaughter to cross that line and to murder their families. And thankfully they did. But we tried unilaterally to do it. We withdrew, and instead of getting the Singapore in the Middle East, all we got was rockets, thousands thousands of rockets on our cities. And when you ask Hamas, why are they attacking? So I hope we're gonna be left with a minion here. But there is a place to be yelling Free Palestine. It's in Ramallah. If you had that among the Palestinians, if you had young people like that among the Palestinians and they could build free societies, maybe we'd be in a different situation. But what happened is when we leave and they took over that territory and they used it as a launching pad for attacks against Israel, that didn't help either. So what is a settlement that you'd like to see? It's a settlement that would obviously require a compromise, but one that would give the Palestinians every single right, except for the right to destroy us. We have to allow them, enable them, all the powers of governing themselves, but none of those powers that could threaten Israel's existence. It's an easy statement, but it's difficult to achieve. Because, I'll give you an example. People talk about a Palestinian state. Well, does that state control the airspace? How many people here have flown into Ben Gurion Airport? A lot. Well, you may know that Ben Gurion is only a few kilometers away from the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. If Israel were to go back to the 1967 lines, sign a piece of paper that says Palestinian state, have no restrictions on their sovereignty, they would control that airspace. And that means a plane, your plane, going into Israel, if it makes a little bit of a turn, and even if it doesn't, if somebody decides to shoot it, they could take that plane out of the sky. Now, does anyone here think that the state of Israel should not control the airspace between the Jordan and the Mediterranean? Because there's not a single Israeli. Maybe there's, it's Israel, you could always find people. But there are very few. What do you do with borders? Do you control the external envelope? It's a question. When the Gaza disengagement happened, Israel not only went back to the border, there was a certain strip called the Philadelphia corridor, a few kilometers long. And Israel withdrew from it. And that's a strip between Egypt and Gaza. And so we didn't control externally the envelope that we could monitor what was coming in. We don't have a problem with goods coming in, supplies, medicine, food. We have a problem with weapons coming in. But because Israel gave up that little strip, you had the smuggling of massive quantities of weapons. There were 1,000 tunnels that were dug over a few kilometers, and all of these rockets and missiles were being smuggled in from Iran through Sudan, up through the Sinai, and then into Gaza. The Egyptian government, thankfully, the current government under President Sisi, has stopped that from happening. So these are real issues. Israel's government, we don't want Palestinians as citizens or subjects of Israel. We want a historic compromise that would enable them to govern themselves and have all those powers they need, except for powers that could affect our very survival. And I know that it's easy to check a box, just leave, just do it. But ultimately, the Prime Minister of Israel is responsible to the people of Israel. And he has to make sure that he keeps them safe, and that a deal that is celebrated on a White House lawn doesn't lead to 1,000 people being killed by terrorist attacks. A disengagement was hailed across the world. People thought it was a great step forward to peace. The people of Israel today don't think that it was such a good idea. Now, that doesn't mean they want to go back tomorrow. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that Israelis are not willing, still willing to make compromises for peace. When they see every time an Israeli government, and every time the Israeli people saw a partner that was willing to make peace with them, that would speak peace to their own people, Israel made peace and made big compromises for peace. The Sinai is about 3 times the size of Israel. Sadat's visit to Israel, talked about 67, 10 years later, Sadat's visit was electrifying. Now, what I think is interesting today is that we have, for the first time in 70 years, we have countries in the Arab world that no longer see Israel as an enemy. The governments, I should say, not the people in these countries, although that's moving as well, but the governments, especially the Gulf countries, that say, you know, Israel is not our enemy. They are a partner for confronting our enemies. This was one of the benefits of the empowerment of Iran over the last few years, that it has actually brought Israel and parts of the Arab world, big parts of the Arab world, together. Now, surfacing this is very complicated, because for 70 years, those governments have poisoned their people to believe the worst about Israel. And so even though they're not democracies, how do you surface it in a way that's sustainable when they've created this reality? They know it. And there's even signs that they're starting to try to change it and at least not pour more fuel on that fire. The best example of it was what happened in the case with Jerusalem and the moving of the embassy. And the protests in Gaza, by the way, had nothing to do with the moving of the embassy. That's not what I said, that's what Hamas says. But sometimes people have a certain narrative, they want to believe what they want to believe so that they connect two things together. But they weren't connected at all. There were protests about the embassy. There was a protest in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. No one was killed, so no one was focused on it. There were virtually no protests in the Middle East. There were probably protests in the shul, right? No? I don't know. Well, maybe they're not members. But maybe there were protests in Chicago. Maybe there were protests in Western Europe. But in the capitals of the Middle East, and I won't say that exactly where, but in the capitals of the Middle East, there were some pro forma statements that were made. But it was sort of like the hound of the Baskervilles, the dog that didn't bark. And Jerusalem is the most sensitive issue in the negotiations. It's the one that has the most significant meaning for the Muslim world, for the Arab world, and you didn't have those protests. And I think that tells you something about where the Arab world is. And I think it's also a product of what has happened in the Middle East in the last few years. We have seen some pretty serious conflicts in the Middle East. I know everybody's focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and obviously people are very passionate about it. We've had 500,000 people killed in Syria. That's an astounding number. And I'm sure those people are very concerned about the Palestinians. I wish they were concerned about all the Palestinians that were killed by the Syrian government. It's thousands and thousands that are killed. Then no one seems to be that concerned about that. But 500,000. You have the collapse of Libya. You have everything that happened in Iraq. You have the terrible situation that you have today in Yemen. There are people who were saying for years that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the root of all conflicts in the Middle East. There are people who actually said that and believed it. It's absurd. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict should be resolved. We hope to resolve it, but it's not going to change the Middle East. You have battles throughout the Middle East, and it's a battle between the forces of modernity and the forces of medievalism. That's what's happening in the Middle East, and we should keep that in perspective when we're thinking about the conflicts and what's happening. But the good news, and I'll finish with this, the good news is, look, Rabbi, I am more hopeful about the prospects of reconciliation than I've ever been in the region. And I say that as somebody who was not a supporter of Oslo. I was not. I wrote about it at the time. I was not a supporter of the disengagement. I wrote about it at the time because I thought, A, you're not going to make peace with a terrorist. And B, if we withdraw, Hamas will just see it as a victory and they will continue their march against Israel. But I am more optimistic today than I've ever been because there is a real change in the Gulf states and other parts of the Arab world in recognizing that we are a potential ally in their threats. And the withdrawal of America and the perception of withdrawal from America in the region makes them see Israel as more important. They see this Iranian
I want to talk
tiger.
about Iran.
I'll ask you, Iranian tiger. They see an ISIS leopard. And ISIS is 2.0. There was Al-Qaeda, there's ISIS, there'll be another one, 3.0. And then all of a sudden they see the 800-pound American gorilla pull out, leave the building. And then they look around and they see a 250-pound gorilla with a kippah on their head. And they say, wait a second, maybe we should work with them to confront these threats. And that's what's happening in the Middle East. I think it's very good news. It's real. Can we succeed in surfacing it and get a process that moves the whole region in a different direction and ultimately moves the Palestinians with us in that direction? That is the goal of diplomacy now, and that is something that we work on, and at least I work on in Washington every day.
You know that on May 8th, the United States withdrew from the JCPOA. Today, Prime Minister Netanyahu and France's President Macron met, and the Prime Minister said, "The nuclear archive that we uncovered recently proves that Iran lied to the world about its nuclear weapon program. And I believe now is the time to apply maximum pressure on Iran, make sure that their nuclear program doesn't go anywhere." President Macron responded by saying that France will continue to work with the existing deal, which it considers the best way to control Iran's nuclear advancement. The French president said he doesn't see how exiting the nuclear deal would help improve regional stability. What's your understanding?
Let me put it to you this way. There's going to be a summit in North Korea 2 weeks from now, 10 days from now. It's June 12th, I think, so I guess a week, 10 days from now. Let's assume this summit and maybe a few meetings, let's assume there's an agreement that is made. And let's say that the British, French, and Germans think that this agreement is great. But the South Koreans and the Japanese think it's a catastrophe. Who are you going to listen to? So it's very nice that the British, French, and Germans think this helps regional stability, but the Israelis and the Arabs who actually live in that region think it's a disaster. We were the guinea pigs in this experiment, and we think it's a disaster. And the decision of President Trump to withdraw from the deal with Iran is something that's supported by Israelis 4-1. And I want people to understand something. I think everybody understands something about the deal because it was a very controversial issue, a very heated issue. I don't think if you were on the other side of that debate that you're an enemy of Israel. I think there were good people on both sides. There were Zionists on both sides. There are people who actually thought that this deal would be better. And there were people in Israel, there were some people in Israel who supported it, people who've dedicated their lives to the security of the state. I don't question the motives, and I say something else. When President Obama said that the nuclear deal with Iran makes not only America safer, Israel safer, I think he was being sincere. I just think he's wrong. There's a difference. And this difference is very important, and to not recognize this difference actually poisons politics. The reason is that you can have an opponent, you can have somebody who disagrees with you, but you always have to separate that from an enemy. And it all comes down to intentions. An enemy can support a policy you disagree with, but the reason they're supporting it is because they want you to be harmed. So I don't think the people there want us, on the other side of that debate, want us to be harmed. But Israel and the Prime Minister of Israel, as I said, the Democratic leader of Israel, and this is something that actually was shared. It's not something that separated the coalition and the opposition, and many things do, the nuclear deal with Iran. And the reason why we are opposed to the deal, it's important to understand it. If there were a deal that actually blocked Iran's path to a bomb, I would be going city to city, synagogue to synagogue, house to house, to argue for people to support such a deal. Because obviously no country has more to gain than Israel to have a deal that would actually block Iran's path to the bomb. The problem with this deal is that that wasn't this deal. This deal didn't do that. What it did is it put temporary constraints on Iran's program that will be automatically removed in a few years. And in those two words, automatically removed, you understand Israel's opposition. Because all Iran has to do is wait. They just wait out the clock. And when they wait out the clock and all the restrictions on centrifuges and enrichment and everything else are removed, Iran doesn't need to sneak in or break into the nuclear club. They just walk in. And a decade may seem to people like a long time in the life of politics, but it's a blink of an eye in the life of a nation. And we saw this deal as a threat to the survival of Israel, because Iran is a regime that openly calls for the eradication of Israel. They tweet about it. The supreme leader of Iran yesterday tweeted that Israel has to be eradicated. They didn't change their view. They didn't lie about it. You know, there was another regime that was going to annihilate the Jews, but they kept arguing that they were interested in peace. This regime in Iran, they never said that. They said we're going to continue our policies. They were very clear about where they were regarding Israel. And this deal gave them the clear path, not to one bomb, but into an entire nuclear arsenal. All they had to do was wait, meanwhile work on the ballistic missiles, work on more advanced centrifuges under the deal, and then they had this vault where they keep their weapons program ready to use in the future. Somebody told me, a very smart guy, former congressman, Jewish guy, calls me up after the Atomic Archive the prime minister did that press conference. I know after people saw it, they thought he was doing an iPhone 12 presentation. All of a sudden, that press conference of the Atomic Archive. So the Jewish congressman calls me up and he says, you know, on Pesach, if you save the chametz, it's because you want to eat it. Or else you destroy it and burn it before. And I thought it was a good way of putting it. He wasn't even a rabbi. And I said, they're leaving this in the safe for a reason. When South Africa dismantled its nuclear weapons program, they destroyed their archive. When Libya dismantled its nuclear program, they destroyed the archive. Iran had an archive with their nuclear weapons program. They lied to the world that they never sought nuclear weapons. They were caught red-handed. And that was there ready to go when the clock would run out on the enrichment restrictions and when they're going to continue to develop their ballistic missiles. So this deal was very dangerous because it posed an existential threat in a few years. And in the meantime, what has happened is to make this deal, not only did the P5, the great powers of the world, give them a clear path to a bomb and an arsenal, they removed all these sanctions. And those sanctions were enormously tough against Iran, financial sanctions, oil sanctions. And by removing the sanctions, they have had tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars flow into Iran's coffers. Now, I'd love to tell you that Iran was using this money to establish a GI Bill for returning members of the Revolutionary Guard. But they were using this money, and are using this money, to fuel their war machine in Iraq through Shia militias, in Syria, establishing permanent bases against Israel there, Hezbollah in Lebanon, their terror proxy there, the Houthis in Yemen. They're trying to do to Saudi Arabia from Yemen what they did to Israel from Lebanon, to create a forward terror base where they can launch missiles and rockets into another country. So Iran was enormously empowered by this deal, the reduction of sanctions, the flow of money there, and it's created a huge danger for Israel. Hundreds of billions of dollars, just to understand why this is a problem. Iran now can sell oil. They couldn't sell oil before. They could only, restricted I should say, they could sell 1 million barrels. Now they're over 2.5. That's an extra 1.5 million barrels. Now the price of oil today was how much? $70, right? So $100 million a day, $3 billion a month, $35 billion a year goes to Iran right now. That's today. Now, when investment comes into Iran and it'll be 3 million barrels a day exported or 4 million barrels and the price of oil goes to 100, you're going to get $100 billion a year. And that money will go to kill Israelis, to buy weapons to kill Israelis. That's where that money is going, and to kill Arabs in the Middle East as well. So we saw this as a great danger. When the Prime Minister came to speak in Congress, you may remember, Rabbi, that was a matter of some controversy. It shouldn't have been. because it is the foremost moral responsibility of a prime minister of Israel to speak out on a matter that affects the survival of our country. 75 years ago, the Jewish people did not have a voice. When we faced threats to our annihilation, we had to beg Polish diplomats to come to Washington and to make a meeting and speak. No more. Today, the Jewish people have a voice, and the prime minister exercised one of his greatest responsibilities. The most important is to defend the country, because another thing that we didn't have 75 years ago was a shield. We had to beg others to defend us. Today, the Jewish people don't beg kings and presidents and prime ministers to defend them. We don't beg them to save our community or to bomb the tracks. Today, the Jewish people defend themselves. But he came to speak in Congress. And what he said there was the dangers of the deal and what was going to happen in the region. That it was not going to make Iran more moderate. He said Iran's not going to join the community of nations, it's going to gobble up the nations. He said that Iran is not going to use this money to improve their lives of their people. They're going to be more extreme. It's going to fuel more aggression and more terror in the region. That was 3 years ago. And at that point, by the way, wherever you were in the debate, it was hypothetical. What was going to happen if the deal was made? Now we're 3 years later. Now we know what happened. This did not push war further away. It brought war literally to Israel's borders. And it's a grave danger. Before we get to 10 years or 15 years with a nuclear ban, we've got a conventional problem with Iran. Iran put a drone into our airspace. It fired rockets for the first time directly at Israel from Syria. These are not theoretical issues. And that nuclear deal with Iran, by removing those sanctions, helped empower the greatest enemy we face. I know that's not what a lot of people intended, but that is what happened. And so that's why we're very grateful for the decision that was made to withdraw from the deal. It hopefully will starve this regime of hundreds of billions of dollars they would otherwise use against us. And I hope other countries, like France, and like Britain, and like Germany, hope that they will ultimately join on that side. And I think one thing, when countries are forced to choose between Iran's $400 billion economy, about the size of Israel, and America's $18 trillion or so economy, they're going to choose America. When banks have to choose between doing business with America, about over 50% of global capital flows are doing business with the great banks in Iran, they're going to choose to do business with America. So America has within its ability tremendous arrows in its quiver to, through secondary sanctions, to force maybe not the world's governments, but the world's businesses. And you've already seen Total say they're not going to invest there. Others will follow. I wouldn't question the resolve of the United States to enforce sanctions. And I think that's very good for Israel. I think it's good for our Arab neighbors. I think it's good for the world. And what I'd like to see is more people join that effort, ratchet up pressure on Iran. And the last thing I'll say about Iran is the Iranian people are not our enemy. I don't think they're America's enemy either. I think, in fact, that Iran's people may be the third most pro-American people in the Middle East. Israel's number one for sure. We fly on our Independence Day. Some of you may have seen this in Israel with the cars when the flags fly. It's the only place I've seen where on that country's Independence Day they fly both their own flag and America's flag. It's unique. I think the Kurds are probably the second most pro-American people in the region. And I think the Iranian people are pro-American. The regime hates America, but the people don't. And I think you have seen internally within Iran, not just in 2009 when it was in the big cities and it was students before that. Now you're seeing the working class in Iran, fed up with this theocracy. And I think that bodes very well for the future, because I do believe that ultimately Iran will be, one day, not with this regime, but one day, will be an ally and partner of both Israel and America. And I think we should try to make that day come as soon as possible.
You are the ambassador to the United States, so I want to talk with you a little bit about your relationship with the people of the United States. Support for Israel is one of the most popular foreign policy positions of the United States over the past 70 years. Could you please discuss Israel's standing, as you understand it, in various American communities, such as the evangelicals, amongst African Americans, amongst Latinos?
So I'd question a couple of the premises in that question. I don't think support for Israel in the United States has always been one of the top issues for 70 years. There's been a big change in support for Israel, but in the first 2 decades, for instance, of the state, people sometimes glamorize the U.S.-Israel relationship, and they think we've had this strategic alliance forever. That's not true. You've probably been to a dozen events, each of you, about Israel, where they mention Harry Truman's decision in 1948. It took him all of 11 minutes to recognize the newly established state of Israel. What they don't usually tell you at those Jewish celebrations is that the American government had an arms embargo on Israel. I don't know why that's an applause, but I'll assume you know why that's an applause. But they had an arms embargo, and there were many Jews in this community and others. Actually, the Crown family was critical at that time to help the state of Israel, the newly established state of Israel, really defending its life as all of our enemies tried to attack us, to really help build up our capacity for self-defense. But for the first 2 decades, Israel did not get strategic support from the United States. It got moral support from certain political leaders. Certainly Jewish community in the United States in those years was critical. Communities, Chicago, I was in Detroit, Milwaukee, throughout the country, that whether it was money, whether it were certain individuals, Hank Greenspun, Al Schwimmer, people who actually defied American laws to help Israel defend itself, to help the Jewish people defend itself 3 years after no one lifted a finger to protect the Jews during the Holocaust. So these Jews are heroes, in my view, that enabled Israel in those critical moments. Mickey Marcus, another American who came over, the first general in Israel's army, to help the Jews for the first time in 2,000 years have the ability to defend themselves. But for the first 20 years, it wasn't America. We fought the 1948 war with Czech rifles. Not because the Czechs make better rifles, because America wouldn't sell them. We fought the '67 war with French planes. Not because the French make better planes, but America wouldn't sell them. Our alliance changed, which is always, I think it's a very important thing to remember, when Israel won its wars. When we proved ourselves on the battlefield, that's when people invested in Israel. When we were seen as a strong ally in the Cold War against the Soviet Union and its client states, they were pouring arms into our enemies. And when that arms embargo was in 1948, our enemies were receiving arms from others. So after that, the relationship changed in the 70s and 80s to strategic support for Israel in the wake of the peace agreement with Egypt. That's when you got the big aid packages to Israel. It was military assistance and economic assistance to Israel because Israel had just withdrawn from the Sinai, which, as I say, is 2 to 3 times the size of Israel, and had oil. And Israel withdrew from that strategically important territory in exchange for peace. It was a compromise supported in Israel, coalition, opposition, widespread, but it was a difficult concession. And to support that effort, the United States decided to give Israel military assistance and economic assistance. We no longer receive economic assistance, we still receive military assistance, which is essentially means that they enable us to use that assistance to buy American platforms like Joint Strike Fighter and things. We have missile cooperation now and Iron Dome and David Sling and the Arrow system. But in the first few decades, it went from moral support in the first 2 to strategic support in the next 3. Then I think you're in a period now where Israel has become and is becoming one of the most important allies that America has in the world. And I argue that Israel will be the most important ally in the 21st century for the United States. Now, that deserves an applause. I'm going to answer your question about the constituencies. I think it's a good one, but I think it's important to understand where we are and how important an ally Israel is. Now, I said that statement not because this administration agrees with us on the nuclear deal and the previous administration didn't. I said that at our first Independence Day in Washington that I celebrated as ambassador, and President Obama was the president, and we disagreed on Iran and a couple of other issues. And I said Israel will be the most important ally of the United States in the 21st century. And the reason why I said it is because I think when it comes to America's security, the critical challenge you're going to face, unfortunately, are going to emanate from the Middle East for many years and decades to come. And to the extent that you don't want to be there, and I don't think you do, and I think this is not something that separates this administration from the previous one, I don't see any political sentiment in the United States to start sending troops to the Middle East. And to the extent you don't want to be there, you need a formidable, reliable ally in the region that shares your values, shares your interests, and can defend those interests and those values. So I think Israel's importance to the United States security will grow, not just because of those dangers, also because we have one of the most formidable intelligence services in the world. How about a round of applause for the Mossad? We have, in Israel, we have foiled some 24 major terrorist attacks in the last few years, and we passed that information to governments. A plane, it was public so I could talk about it, but a plane that was going to be blown out of the sky, that was going to take off in Australia. Other attacks of the magnitude that occurred in Paris when over 100 people were killed. Those types of attacks, it's Israel and Israel's military, Mossad, and intelligence services that provided that information to people around the world. So people get how important Israel's security. The other thing they don't get, they get a little bit, is that Israel is a global technological power. Now, if an Israeli ambassador was in this shul 30 years ago, I bet you there was an Israeli ambassador in this shul 30 years ago, and would have told you, 30 years, Israel is going to become a global technological power. You would have said, nice Jewish boy, but that's not going to happen. But it happened. And Israel's a global power in agriculture, global power in water. It's a global power in cyber. Last 2 years, Israel, which is all of 0.1% of the world's population, accounts for 20% of private global investment in cyber. So in cyber, Israel's punching 200 times above our weight. In cyber, we're not a country the size of New Jersey. In cyber, Israel's bigger than China. And autonomous vehicles, and healthcare, and so many innovations that are happening that you know about, from the ways that you have in your car to the exoskeleton that helps paraplegics stand to half the medicines probably in your medicine cabinet. Israel is a global technological power. Now, if you had to choose one country in the world to be your partner in innovation, who would you choose? Britain? No. France? No. Germany? No. Israel. In absolute terms, because of the innovations happening. So in security and technology, to the extent that the United States, no matter what your politics are, what your positions are, anything else, you want a partner that's going to help keep your people safe, that's going to give prosperity to your people, Israel is that partner. And I think this will become clear. Sometimes we focus on the political differences over this or that issue, and we lose sight of these fundamentals. What I just told you now doesn't depend on whether we agree on Iran or we agree on the peace process, or it's the fundamental things that are driving the United States and Israel together, because when the 8th most powerful country in the world, and some of those people on that list are not friends of the United States, is also the most, I think, the second great center of innovation in the world, that's an important ally for the United States. But what has happened now this is a very short answer to a long question. Your question now that you ask, I'm kidding. Got to lighten up a little bit here. If you look at public opinion, what you have seen is that public opinion towards Israel, Gallup actually studies this. If you guys are interested in the statistics, every year Gallup asks the question, do you have a favorable view of a country? and it lists different countries, and it's year after year after year. And if you look at the data, you will see right now that Israel is almost at a record high in terms of favorability. There was only one other time, and it was almost 30 years ago in 1991 during the Gulf War, where Israel had a more favorable opinion than it has today. It's about 74% of the American public. Intensity of support for Israel has never been higher. It's 31%, very favorable. Intensity of opposition to Israel is not as high as ever been and much lower than people think. Now, you know, the protesters that speak up, they attract a lot of attention. But if you look at the data, what you see is that support for Israel is very strong. Now, one thing we have to make sure of is that support for Israel remains bipartisan, because you can't fly a plane with one wing. But if you look at the numbers, you see this general trend of a rise. One was a brief spike in 91. The second was after 9/11, the numbers started to actually rise in support for Israel, because many people said to themselves, wait a second, we are you and you are us. We are fighting the same fight. We're confronting the same enemies. And they sort of got it. And if you look within the data, you see actually a difference between Republicans and Democrats, a gap, which we don't want to see. We'd like to see those two lines be the same the whole time. But most of the gap is because the rise on the Republican side has been very, very high. Not because it's been so much a fall off on the Democratic side. But I think it's important to reach out to every constituency in America and to connect with them about Israel, and particularly the constituencies you mentioned that are, by and large, not all on the progressive side of your political spectrum. Very important to reach out. The African American community, the Hispanic American community, the LGBT community is very important as well, because Israel is the only source for progressive values in the Middle East. It's the only one. Think about women's rights. We're one of the few countries in the world that have had a woman sit and serve ahead all three branches of our government. Prime Minister, Golda Meir, a Speaker of the Knesset, Dalia Itzik, and we've had two Supreme Court justices who are women. Now, a lot of European, Scandinavian democracies can't boast of that record. Look at the issue of gay rights. I love when people tell me that Israel has the largest gay pride parade in the Middle East. That's a pretty low bar. It's the only place. Because we're a free and open society. Israel, I have news, this may be news for your synagogue, we're not a perfect country. It's imperfect. But it's a free country. And I think it's something where when you bring leaders, African American leaders, Hispanic American leaders, and others to Israel, they see a very different country than they thought was there. And when they come to Israel and see it for themselves, when they see that you've got Arab judges on our Supreme Court, when we've got gay members of our Knesset, when we have Druze ministers, they leave with a different perception of Israel. So I think it's important on the progressive side of the aisle to keep reaching out, to keep showing them the true Israel. It's very hard to do that when the media distorts it, you know? If all you look is every blemish of Israel and everyone puts a magnifying glass on that day after day after day after day after day, people can get actually a very distorted picture of Israel. And the best way to puncture that, it's not what I say, and I can give all the context I want, and I can do all the interviews I want. It's just go there. Go to Israel, go to Jerusalem, walk down to the Kotel, see Jews praying there, go up to the Temple Mount, see Muslims praying there, go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, see Christians, speak to the people, see what the truth is about Israel. Don't read about it in the newspaper, don't watch it on television, go and see for yourself. And I think the more we do that, the more engaged with those communities, I think the closer will be our relations with them long term. So I think support for Israel is very high. There are always places where you can do more. We have to be mindful. of the concerns that people have and try to address them. But look, one thing I try to do as ambassador of people who are focused on this or that controversy and this or that problem in Israel is to remind them that our grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents, going back 100 generations, would have given anything to trade their problems with ours. So yes, there are problems, and yes, there are controversies, and yes, there are issues, but those people who know Jewish history understand how blessed we are as a generation. 100 generations dreamed of the privilege to live at a time when there'd be a sovereign Jewish state. And one thing I want to say, the price of sovereignty is imperfection. When you are a victim, you can be perfect. When you are a powerless victim, you can be perfect. Because you're not an agent in the world, you're a spectator. When Israel becomes a sovereign nation, when it becomes an actor, a player, then it has to deal with what other sovereign nations, it has to forge alliances. You asked about evangelical Christians, and that's strong support from evangelical Christians. When you're a sovereign nation, you reach out to all parties. We reach out to countries. We don't necessarily agree with all their policies, but we reach out to those countries, and we embrace the large Christian community in the United States that supports us. I know that many people are concerned about, well, I hear this all the time, well, they just want to convert you at the end of the day, and Messiah will come, and it'll be an apocalypse. And what I say to my evangelical friends, I say, look, when the Messiah comes, we'll ask him, were you here before or not? And if he says yes, then I guess you're right. And if it's not, then I'm right. In the meantime, let's work together. And I think that's a pretty good way of dealing with it.
As a conservative rabbi, I have to say this has been a challenging year. I was one of the blacklisted rabbis last summer, which was not only angering, but extremely painful because of my love for Israel, because of the work that we have done in this congregation over the decades. Issues with the Kotel, and the list goes on. We work assiduously to teach Zionism, to make sure that any person in this community that wants to go to Israel can go to Israel, and we will get them there. But we are also, on this side, in an existential struggle against assimilation, building a future, instilling a love for Israel in the next generation. So I'm interested to know your thoughts on where things are moving with the non-Orthodox community vis-a-vis Israel. And I then want to kind of move into a conversation about college campuses.
So first of all, I want to thank you for your support, and for other rabbis throughout America, non-Orthodox rabbis, conservative, reform, and otherwise, for their support for Israel, and it's something we are very grateful for. It wasn't always the case, not during the early days of Zionism. The reform movement, changed, and that was a blessing for Israel. That the largest movement in the United States at the time went from a position that didn't accept Zionism to accepting Zionism. That was a big shift. And the same thing with the conservative movement, and I go to synagogues around the country when I get the opportunity to get out of the Washington bubble, and you could see the passion and the commitment and the dedication that so many rabbis have towards the state of Israel. So we're very grateful for that.
I just want to interrupt you and say that this congregation has always had rabbis who have stood square with the state of Israel, going back from the earliest days to the present.
Give yourself a round of applause. And I think one thing, before I get to the specific questions of what you said, a Western Wall and conversion issue and other really hot button issues, I think one thing that people don't always think about, and they don't think about its implications, is a shift that's happened in Jewish life over the last 70 years. 70 years ago, 1948, the Jews of Israel accounted for 5% of the world's Jewish population. 600,000 Jews. One of them was my mother. 600,000 Jews out of a population of 12 million. Before the Holocaust, we were around 18 million. 6 million were killed, 1/3 of the Jewish people. It's hard to imagine 1/3 of the people being killed. To put that in numbers, it's about over 100 million Americans. And if you can't wrap your minds around that, that's a 9/11 every day for a century. That's what the Holocaust did to the Jewish people. Well, 1948, 600,000. In Israel, 12 million around the world, 5%. Major community was here in the United States. This was the biggest community, was the center, certainly, of Jewish life. Israel always had a special place because it was Israel. Because it was our homeland, it's because where we turn towards, they don't turn towards New York or Chicago or LA in prayer. They turn towards Jerusalem. So it always had a special place, but we didn't have the numbers. About 10 years ago, I think it was in 2007, Israel became the largest Jewish community in the world for the first time since the age of Bar Kokhba in the 2nd century. Today, about 44% of the world's Jews live in Israel, about 35% live in America. It's about 80% together, and 20% is the rest of the world. Now, that's a big shift, and it changes the nature of the relationship. And I think part of the dislocations you have are because of this shift and what it means. And I think it means also that Israel has greater responsibilities, frankly, because we're not the small junior partner with that special homeland status. We're the mothership. We're the hub. And there are a lot of spokes in Chicago, Detroit, everywhere around the world. Could be Budapest, could be London, could be Paris. And we have to make an investment, in my view, in strengthening those Jewish communities around the world. One program that was started 20 years ago by the Prime Minister in this was Birthright. And when the Prime Minister, I wasn't there that day because I wasn't with him at that time, but apparently it was quite a scene when the Prime Minister walked in and said he was going to start taking government money to pay for young American Jews to come over to Israel. That didn't just go over so smoothly. And here you'll see Balin and Michael Steinhardt and Lynn Schusterman after, and of course Sheldon Adelson, who's the biggest contributor to Birthright. That's a program that has actually created a real change in Jewish identity, and that's what the data shows. And there's other programs as well. So that's one issue, but there's many more things that Israel has to do, I believe, to strengthen and to help those communities strengthen Jewish identity. And I think it's actually the most important thing that you can do also for Israel. Many of my predecessors are illustrious, but two of them probably stand out. The great Abba Eban, maybe some of you here heard him speak. I was honored to meet him once on an Independence Day celebration at the ambassador's residence in Tel Aviv, and he always spoke in full paragraphs. And the second, of course, Yitzhak Rabin, Zichrono Livracha. And Rabin would go around to speak to Jewish communities, and they asked him, what can we do for Israel? And you know what he'd say? Strengthen Jewish identity in your communities. Strengthen Jewish education. And there's nothing you can do more for Israel than that, because that will keep your community strong, and the stronger your community is, the more you're going to be connected to a Jewish state. Now, and I agree, I couldn't agree with him more. Exactly, I would say the same thing 50 years later as Israel's ambassador to the United States. Now, as to your question, we have had a situation for 70 years, a religious status quo, and whether it was smart or wasn't smart is a separate matter, but a religious status quo that basically said Jewish communities abroad, conversions of Jewish community abroad, those will be accepted in the law of return. But there's an issue when those people come to Israel about marriage and divorce and other things. By the way, it's not just an issue for converts abroad. It's also an issue because we don't have civil marriage in Israel. Now, it's nice to think we can wave our magic wand and get civil marriage tomorrow, but that's a decision that has to actually go through the Knesset, and because of Israel's political system, that has not happened. But it's not a change. It's a continuation of a problem that has been existing for a very long time, and there's efforts to change it. And there's efforts to change it through the courts, through Israel's courts, and by and large, non-Orthodox streams have used those courts to try to get a change in status. And it's not just non-Orthodox, it's also Orthodox. You know, I'm sorry that you were put on this list. I think the idea of a blacklist should never be done, of any rabbi outside of Israel. But it wasn't just conservative and reform. There were also Orthodox rabbis that were put on the list, and Orthodox conversions within Israel that are not done by the rabbinate in Israel. Those are also not accepted. And you can't do those conversions as well. And what happens is there's an effort to petition the courts, and then there's an effort in a response to the courts to go to the Knesset. And so you have this kind of battle over the religious status quo in Israel. I will tell you my view, based on what I've seen, what works and what doesn't work, to advance pluralism in Israel, is to try to do it to the best degree possible through consensus. Because the mistake is to think you're going to snap your fingers and you're going to solve the problem and that's going to be the end of it, because it won't be. Because the ultra-Orthodox population in Israel, they are citizens of our state, and they will remain citizens of our state. Not going to wish them away, and they are part. And I think integrating them into the Israeli economy and Israeli society is one of the most important things within Israel for us to do, and I think that it's an enormous boost for our country. But they are part of our democracy. They are part of our mosaic. And you can think that you'll win a battle one day, but then the next day something changes. And just to give you a story can explain the quirks of Israeli politics. So if you go into the chief rabbinate's offices in Jerusalem and you look at the wall of the chief rabbis, you'll see that the pictures begin to change somewhere in the 1990s, because most of the early chief rabbis were not from the ultra-Orthodox streams of Judaism. They were from the more national religious parties. And it changed around the 90s. And I ask people sometimes, well, when did that change happen? It happened actually because of Oslo. People remember that Shas supported Oslo? Remember that? Some people may. They supported the Oslo Accords. No one remembers what the party got in return. It was a change in the chief rabbinate. And most people at the time who are in the pluralistic community said to themselves, listen, we'll worry about that later. Right now we'll get peace. Then we'll worry about that. But well, peace didn't exactly come, and now we're dealing with a reality 20 years later. So the mistake to think is that it's on one side of the political aisle or another. It's the nature of Israel's political systems. We have small parties. They are empowered in Israel in a way that they're anywhere else. The best thing that you can do for pluralism in Israel, frankly, is to change the electoral system of Israel. That reform hasn't gone through, but that would, I think, affect a lot of these issues. The other thing I could tell you is if 1 million Reform and conservative Jews came to Israel, that would also change things pretty dramatically, because then they'd be a constituency within Israel that was very powerful and very strong, and that would make their case just as the other constituencies make their case. But in the meantime, what Israel has to do is to make sure that every Jew around the world understands that tomorrow they can come to Israel, understands that Israel is a home, take an issue like the Western Wall, and ensure that we do what we can to make sure that that remains a place that unites Jews and doesn't divide them, and that we try to find compromises and practical solutions to problems even when we may not agree ideologically. And there is a space for practical compromise. I saw it happen, on an issue that was extremely sensitive, which was the issue of burial. And we had a situation where we have many immigrants from the former Soviet Union who were not Jewish and technically could not be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Now imagine you got a soldier who died defending Israel, but because they're not Jewish, can't be buried in a cemetery. It was when I first came to Israel, it was one of the harshest issues, and it was dealt with, actually. Special arrangements were made in cemeteries, even with halakha, they figured out the answer to the problem because people understood this was a problem and they figured out how to deal with it. And now it doesn't make those headlines. There is practical space that is much bigger than people think. And I think it's a mistake to rush to ideological wars where everybody loses and not seek to maximize that common ground. It is there. And whether it means building that space, that other space at the Kotel and making sure that it's up to the standards that the Supreme Court calls for, or finding other practical solutions to the problems, and that the sides will, I think, stay true to their ideological convictions, and they shouldn't be asked to change them, but we should seek to the greatest degree possible to find that common ground and to move in that direction. And one last thing. Look, no one wants to see a disunited Jewish people. But the idea that the Jewish people were united in history, I mean, read the Bible. No, seriously. Or even peace. We're a 4,000-year-old people. To the best of my knowledge, we had 40 years of peace under King Solomon. That's 1%. I'd love to believe we're going to snap our fingers and solve all our problems tomorrow, and the Jewish people will have peace, and the Jewish people were united. But Moses, when he left Egypt, didn't have a united Jewish people. After all of those miracles and all of those wonders, what we have to do in order to remain united, in my view, is we've got to get more and more people to understand how lucky we are. Because we're the generation of the Maccabees that has witnessed the restoration of Jewish sovereignty and the rebirth of Jerusalem. And I'm sure that Maccabees thought it was going to last forever, that it was so miraculous, that there was the few against the many, that they defied the odds, and that Jewish history had somehow ended. But it didn't. And then they were divided. And there wasn't unity. And there was Kamsa, and there was Bar Kamsa, and there was baseless hatred. And we probably look at those people and say, how did you not see it? How did you let these small issues get in the way of the things that were most important? And we should always remember that. And I think if we do, people will be critical of Israel. It's a free country and people should raise their voice. But understand how precious this possession is that we've inherited. We've inherited from our parents and our grandparents. And that we've had this great privilege to live at a time when there's this Jewish state. And what we should do with that privilege is understand we also have a responsibility, which is to secure that dream for the future and not be, frankly, I guess the word is flippant with the attacks. Israel's not perfect. Israel should be criticized when it does wrong. But understand how lucky we are to be in this generation. Let's not make the mistakes of the Maccabees. Let the modern Maccabees make sure that we secure this for generations and generations to come.
Well, I have to believe that no one has gone to more celebrations of the 70th anniversary of Israel than you. Perhaps you'll close this evening with sharing what for you was the most powerful moment of this year of celebration.
So I would say two. I'm not going to give you a quick, short answer for that question, but I would say two.
I don't think you're going to start now.
That's good. We're going to take this show on the road. The first thing is we did an Independence Day event on May 14th in Washington, and we recognized 70 Americans, honorees, who have made a uniquely valuable contribution to the U.S.-Israel alliance. And I don't know if you follow on social media, but every day I would announce one of these honorees. And they were all over. They were political people, senators like Scoop Jackson and Daniel Inouye or Joe Lieberman, and they were philanthropists like the Sabans, the Adelsons, Schusterman. The Crown family was actually one of the families, you have Pride, Chicago Pride. There were people unsung heroes, playwrights like Ben Hecht, all sorts of individuals that, Mickey Marcus was another one, of people we recognized. And I'm going to send you a copy of this book that we published with all of their stories about Israel. But at this event that we did in May 14th in Washington, we brought them together. There were 20 who were living, and then we brought the children and the grandchildren. The grandchild of Justice Brandeis, who was on our list, was there. The grandson is a young age of 90. And the grandson of Harry Truman, who was on our list, was there. And all of these figures who have contributed so much to Israel. And for me, it was a very meaningful project, because the year before, when I spoke at our Independence Day event, I gave the story, I spoke about that story from the Talmud of the old man who's planting the carob tree, and somebody's walking along the road and says, why are you planting that? How long does it take for it to blossom, to bear fruit? He said, 70 years. We said, well, you're an old man. He says, yeah, but my grandfather planted it for me, and I'm planting it for my children and my grandchildren. And I said, well, we're the beneficiaries of this great alliance between the United States and Israel, and I'd like to take one day to recognize all of these people who have done so much to water that tree and to cultivate it and to tend to it over the years, and to bring them all to one place in Washington was a truly a special occasion. And of course, the second one is throwing out the first pitch at a Cubs game. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Friends, I'm going to call on Rabbi George Shakin-Gould to close our program.
Friends, thank you for joining us tonight. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Dermer for joining us this evening. And please join me in also thanking Consul General Aviv Ezra for bringing this program to our home. We hope that you will continue the dialogue with us here in our community. Have a wonderful night.